Volksgadian Crinu shud the Udros Pauline nach den Herren Crinu Pibli Garda Commissioner agus Cholakaha and Kate Keon Tresh Sosataurig agus Nart Le Play going. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Policing Authority of Ireland being held in public with the Commissioner of the Garda Síochána and some of his senior colleagues. First after the since July, but many items for discussion. We've had very many meetings of the Policing Authority when all of the Garda representatives were men, with one exception, that of the Commissioner. And today we have, I think, for the first time, a meeting where all the Garda representatives are women, with one exception, that of the Commissioner. So the world spins, the world changes, and life continues. So you're very welcome, Commissioner, and your colleagues. The first item on our agenda this afternoon is the question of the cancellation of the 999 calls, the CAD 999 issue as it's described. Many who were watching this will recall that when we met last July, we spoke of the appointment of Mr. Derek Penman as an external person to look into the questions that had been raised by the cancellation of these calls. And Mr. Penman began his work immediately following that appointment. We had hoped that we would have had something by way of a report perhaps by the end of August. That turned out to be ambitious for a number of reasons. The calendar, August is not the easiest month in which to operate. Secondly, there were some delays in getting information from the Garda Síochána to Mr. Penman, but most of that has been dealt with now since the beginning of September. And thirdly, there is an enduring issue in relation to the capacity for the external investigator to listen to a selection of the calls that were made to 999 so that he can form a judgment on the nature of the response to those calls, which is central to the completion of the terms of reference that were set for him. The Garda Síochána and the Policing Authority have worked closely to seek to find a resolution to these, and external joint Council's opinion is being sought. When I say joint, external opinion being sought both for the Garda Síochána and for the authority. And we hope that will be available as soon as ever possible. And that is a condition precedent to the completion of that central part of the terms of reference. However, I'm happy to say that we will be in a position at the October meeting of the authority to have an interim report from Mr. Penman, which deals with a range of other issues that he has identified and in respect of which he has observations to make and perhaps recommendations to make. And we will have that in time before the meeting of the next meeting of the authority at the end of October, to share with the Commissioner and his colleagues. And perhaps we may also, again, Commissioner, ask that we might be facilitated by having at least part of that meeting in public, so that the real public interest that there is in this issue can be given an opportunity to hear from the Penman work at the earliest possible opportunity. Pending that that development, excuse me, at the next meeting, there are a number of issues that we might touch upon today. I've a number of questions, and colleagues may wish to join in relation to these. The first is to ask you and your colleagues to give a sense of the actions that have been taken since we met on the 29th of July, in terms perhaps of three things. One is the approaches that the Garda Síochána have been making to victims to whom a service might not or was not provided at the time in the way that they would have expected. The second is in the issue of the work that has been done in relation to the development of staff and the management of individual performances where appropriate. And the third is something that we don't propose to go into any detail for obvious reasons, but to inquire if you are taking any disciplinary type actions in relation to any individuals, or if any such are in contemplation. But the primary focus would be on the issue of the quality of the performances and steps that are being taken to enhance those and to engage with people where there may have been evidence that quality performance was lacking. So, Commissioner, you or your colleagues who might want to respond to some of those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, if I ask AC Anne-Marie Cagney to lift the first 2 points, and then Deputy Commissioner Coxon to lift the last point. If I might say that we continue to have a focus on this. We've worked, I think, very closely with Mr. Derek Penman. We've been very impressed with the expertise that he has brought to bear in terms of his experience of police control rooms and his particular expertise around systems and processes. And that, I think, will stand us in good stead in terms of the report, but also what we'll want to develop in terms of the new system, CAD2. So, and we also hope, in conjunction with the authority, just to be able to resolve the data protection issue that surrounds the listening, in effect, to the live recorded calls. If I might look initially then to Anne-Marie in terms of the contact there's been with victims and the engagement with them, and then secondly the piece in respect of training and interventions with staff. Please, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair. Chair, just to advise in terms of this stage of the CAD examination, which we refer to as stage 6, significant work has been undertaken by the organisation, by each regional, in relation to the victim engagement piece. And I'm happy to report that all of the files at stage 6 have been reviewed by the divisional teams, and quite a significant portion of victim engagement has taken place. In fact, the victim engagement piece is almost complete. Unfortunately, there are a small number of victims where we are unable to make contact with them at this time. It would appear that they have left the jurisdiction, or that they have changed addresses and we're not in possession of forwarding addresses. Notwithstanding that, the information is being garnered and further engagement will take place with those victims as we gain that additional information. The majority of victims that we're engaging with are very happy with the engagement. They're very appreciative of the manner of engagement of our staff, and they have been offered all of the supports that are required for them as they make their way through their journey with Garda Síochána. Chair, as you're aware, there were a number of technical fixes put in place prior to your last meeting, but just to advise that there was a further technical fix put in on the 12th of September 2021, and that's where we put in one further mitigation in respect of the clear command on CAD. So again, that further mitigation will prevent any issues for the organisation going forward. Chair, in terms of the training, we have an excellent training package delivered and developed in Garda Síochána, specifically focused on our teams in the communications rooms, and they involve a lot of the procedural matters that are contained within the HQ directives and guidance documents and policies that are in place for our callers and our dispatchers. But indeed, we've also incorporated a focus on domestic abuse interventions, domestic abuse prevention pieces, and supports for victims who are subject of domestic abuse. That also includes the ability of our teams to understand how to engage with persons who phone Garda Síochána through this process, and to ensure that they get a good service in that first interaction with ourselves. We have worked with the Garda National Protective Services Bureau both in the development of that aspect of our training programme and in the delivery of that particular programme. And Chair, that's particularly important because what we do there is we get a good opportunity during the delivery of this training to allow our teams to ask those difficult questions and to get a greater understanding of how you can get an approach so right to make sure that a victim feels that he or she are being listened to and that their concerns are being dealt with in an appropriate manner. So that training is ongoing as we speak. I'm happy to say that in most of the regions the training is complete. In terms of the review of the training, the feedback is very significant in terms of the positive manner in which our teams are embracing that training. They're very appreciative of the training, and they have a greater understanding of their roles now as call takers and dispatchers. There's the remaining training, Chair, has been listed for delivery, and that is ongoing by an excellent team that we've appointed to this. What I will say as well in terms of the procedural piece is we have also made sure that each call taker and dispatcher have been fully briefed on all call entry and call closure dispositions, and that's particularly important for them because that's that piece that they need to be ensured, and they need to reassure themselves that they know what the procedures are there. And then all the units have been briefed on the new CAD incident types that have been put in place. And on top of that, then what we have done is we have put sergeants with a role of reviewing all calls on their tour of duty. And then the data quality piece was to be examined on a quarterly basis as part of the standard inspection and reviews under HQ Directive 59 of 2014. On top of that as well, Chair, and again, just to reassure you on the performance approach in relation to our members, the supervisors and indeed the superintendent in the control room in the DMR is engaging on a one-to-one with our members, both call takers and dispatchers, to make sure that they fully understand their role within the communications room and the standards that are expected of them. And a lot of that is done through that guidance and HQ directive examination and those frank discussions that are had afterwards around their understanding of what is expected. As well as that, there's that dip sampling system that we have put in place also, and that's done by the superintendent. And that is in an effort to make sure that persons are conducting their activities correctly in this particular area. And I think that's about it for the moment, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions in relation to the approach that we're taking. Thank you.
Thank you, AC Cagney. I think it's excuse me. It's important for those who are viewing and listening to this to note that everybody who's engaged in handling of CAD 999 calls will have been through a substantial 4-week training course as a compulsory part of their involvement prior to becoming involved, and that this is. I'm right in saying that, am I not? And that this is supplementary training. I'm all for training in these circumstances, but we shouldn't overlook the fact that everybody who was involved in the issues that arose had been the recipient and the participant in a 4-week comprehensive training course, which is comprehensive and pretty complete. In relation to the performance management part of the actions taken, is there an understanding, do you think, arising from the individual conversations that have taken place? Is there an understanding of the significance and the scale and the impact of some of the decisions that were taken in the cancelling of calls?
Look down, Marie, again there, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Chair, I'd like to reassure you, yes, that we are noticing a greater understanding in that area, both in those one-to-one conversations that are being had with the supervisors. But again, I myself attended to the training that was delivered as well, because I wanted to get a greater sense of whether people understood, particularly around their roles, but particularly understood the implications of the approach that we take and how that can lead to good service delivery for our communities. And again, during those discussions, and they were extensive discussions, you do get a sense of a greater understanding when you do have those frank discussions around that personal responsibility piece. And I suppose what I really found myself was when you had those conversations around how well we can support victims when we get it right, and the buy-in was significant in relation to that. And really, what I found with our teams is they fully understood how valued their roles are in that particular area. So I think that element of the training, as well as the one-to-one with the supervisors, really supported that understanding.
Thank you, Assistant Commissioner Cagney. Does any of the colleagues wish to raise anything on this before I move on to another aspect of it? Shalom.
Just have a few quick questions for Assistant Commissioner Cagney. Could I ask, is that training delivered internally by the Garda Síochána?
Yes, Ms. Binchy, it is delivered internally by Garda Síochána, but just to reassure you, we've had support from some of our victim support groups. And again, we have engaged with Women's Aid as well in the development of the training programme. And again, they are very satisfied with the contents that we've put in place.
And how long does the training last?
Just to clarify, it's a full day's training. So it's an extensive day's training that we give to our teams. And
you said that there was one-to-one conversations, frank discussions with some of the relevant people who are call takers and dispatchers. Was that done on a planned basis? Was everyone spoken to? Was there the same conversation with everyone? And for example, was there any extra thought given to people who might have needed maybe a deeper conversation, maybe people who had cancelled more calls than others?
Just to reassure you, Ms. Binchy, the nature of my own engagement was through that group process. And again, where individuals felt that they could ask those questions and address them as part of a group setting in the training programme. The one-to-one engagement that's done through the supervisors, and particularly around the superintendent's role in the communications room in Harcourt Square, is much more detailed. And again, those conversations are specific to individual roles in the CAD cancellation.
But did that take place with everyone? Did everyone have a one-to-one conversation?
I just, for the purposes of today's meeting, unfortunately, I can't clarify whether everybody has received that, but certainly I know it's ongoing. And again, you're aware that we have a significant team here in the DMR, so I just can't clarify that for you today.
Okay, and you said that there was, improvements in how people take calls and respond, particularly to domestic violence type calls. Can you describe what those improvements are?
Again, what I spoke about was a greater understanding of their role and a greater understanding of how important it is that when we get it right, that we are able to effect service delivery correctly. And again, that's around that discussion piece. And again, it's featuring in the DIP sampling as well that the superintendent is conducting. And she's satisfied that she sees a good increase in service delivery in these areas.
Yeah, and that sounds great, but it's a little bit vague. I mean, could you give us an idea of practically what has changed?
The understanding of the nature of engagement on the initial phone calls that are received, the understanding of the urgency of certain calls, and the understanding of the overall 360 process in terms of cancellation in the correct manner, or the creation of the various pulse incidents and supports then that can be affected as a result of that.
So the understanding has changed, but have the nature have the questions changed? Has the nature in which the questions are asked, has that changed? Has the information gathered changed?
We are seeing a definite change in that, and we're seeing a greater understanding. And again, what the superintendent is reporting is that she's quite satisfied that the nature of approach to these calls and the level of questions, and indeed the overall approach that the individuals are taking, has improved significantly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Binchy.
Might I add, Chair, just I think we ourselves will need to effect a shift in people's perception of this work, because it is actually the first point of contact, and command and control, as it's called at the moment, actually doesn't catch the complexity of it. It really, we should be regarding it as contact, command and control, because it is the first contact and members of the public have with Garda Síochána, particularly in an emergency call type scenario. And we, rather than this quite sterile notion of command and control, there is a piece there around victim engagement, and we have to just think going forward how we make that far more central in terms of service that we provide from the existing control rooms.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Elaine.
I just have one question. In terms of understanding, is there any understanding as to why those calls were cancelled? Were they cancelled because who made them?
We haven't seen a pattern in terms of who made them, and that question has arisen, I think, before either at the May or the June meeting, and we specifically looked for that, and we couldn't see a pattern in the data that we had which would suggest that there was behaviour which might have been prejudicial towards one sector of the community or another.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Commissioner. Then can I move on to another aspect of this? And Assistant Commissioner Cagney made reference to a further fix that was introduced on the 12th of September, which I presume is a reference to what was brought to attention then, and I'm happy to say was immediately brought to through me to the authorities' attention by Deputy Commissioner McMahon on the day that it was made known to her. I think by Chief Superintendent Mangan, and that is that despite all of the steps that had been taken in last October, November, and since, and despite the intensity of the focus that there was on this issue, that nonetheless there was an individual, perhaps a group of individuals, who were cancelling calls or finding a way around the new policies and practices that had been introduced, and were cancelling calls inappropriately. Now, as I say, we appreciated very much at the time the fact that that was brought immediately to our attention, and it was followed up by a breakdown of the nature of the calls involved. And I wonder, Commissioner, if you would tell us what you thought yourself of this development, and what might have prompted it, and what you think it suggests or reveals about the individuals, if there were more than one concerned, and what steps you have taken and you think are appropriate to be taken in that regard.
You're correct. A further number of cases were in effect cancelled outside of the process which was determined and directed upon in November of last year, and they total some 53 cases. The majority are alarm calls. I think all of them would have been subject to cancellation if they'd been forwarded on to supervisor, but in these cases they weren't, and individual dispatchers, it appears, undertook it themselves to cancel these calls. This is now subject to inquiry, and that will include a discipline investigation. I have to say that taking this as a group, and I don't want to talk about the individuals, it's very disappointing given huge focus there's been on this. There's been a lot of public commentary and debate, but there's been a huge amount of focus on this internally by supervisors, through training, through engagement. I myself have walked the floors of the various command and control centres on numerous occasions, actually. So it's not that people could have missed the importance of this. So I don't want to pass commentary on what it means, because we don't have their explanation as to why this was done. And in fairness, there may be some explanation as to why it was done, but it was done outside the process that we determined. And the difficulty is when you move outside the process that we determined was proper, you risk then a service delivery failure. In these cases, there does not seem to have been a service delivery failure, but that's the risk that we run. And we have to be sure that we've put in place a process that it is adhered to. So it has been looked at. It is taken very seriously. I think all of us were shocked given the time and effort that has been dispensed on this at all levels of the organisation, the amount of time it's taken up really throughout the spring and into the summer, that this still occurred. And as I say, very disappointing, but in terms of its impact, it's very different from the original matters that were discovered. but it was discovered, and it was an employee, one of our own members of staff, in effect brought it to our attention through, as you say, Chief Superintendent Mangan, and we were able then to resolve this issue again.
I understand your reluctance to comment on individuals or even a group of individuals for reasons that are fairly clear, because some of this may come to you for adjudication at some stage in the future. But it is a strikingly, well, almost bizarre development, particularly in circumstances where there was emergency calls are never banal, but that there was a degree of banality perhaps attending these. They were mundane, insignificant, as you say, calls that might perfectly properly have been cancelled if the procedure were complied with, the procedures that had been introduced arising from the initial difficulties that had been discovered. And one wonders about what might have been in the contemplation of people who, knowing all that they knew, nonetheless took a course of action which was entirely different from what had been provided for and laid down and publicly multiple times spoken about. And it raises the question that we had asked before when this initially came to light, and in some of the subsequent discussions, about the performance management area within the organisation, and about the role of the Garda Síochána as employers in terms of either the continuing development of staff, the drawing to attention of individuals of inappropriatenesses of behaviour, the raising of the question as to whether people might not be in the most appropriate part of the organisation, whether their skills and talents might be used differently in other areas. Because this could easily have had an impact on the quality of service delivered to the public. It didn't, mercifully, it would appear in this case, in the 53 cases that you identify. But 53 improper cancellations is not a small amount, small by comparison with the pre-existing bundle. But it is very difficult to get one's head around it, including the risk that these individuals must have known that they were taking by acting in such a blatant departure from procedures that had been laid down. I just wonder whether you have any insights in relation to that, or any thoughts that you can share with us.
Well, Chair, I do wish I had an insight actually into the motivation around this, but in truth, I don't. I don't understand it. And as you've set out yourself, the amount of time and effort and how I highlighted this issue as being and our response, I would have thought would have entirely precluded someone deciding to take a shortcut of their own volition when actually there was a process which was going to get them to the same place. And none of this was of any benefit to them, and yet it has exposed all of them now to the peril of inquiry. And as you say, it does open up the question as to horses for courses. People, and I speak generally here, where we have processes which are so important around service delivery, they do have to be adhered to, because it's by those processes that we can be sure that we have proper service delivery, and particularly in these most crucial areas that we've talked about before, in terms of, say, domestic abuse or other emergency calls where there's real risk. We have to stick with the process, because the process is there to make sure the appropriate and speedy response is applied. So it is no small thing then to decide, no, I have my own process here. There is a reality of then whether one can continue to trust someone's judgment when they're in such a crucial position. This is we call it command control, but it is first contact, and often with people who are in an emergency scenario and indeed at great vulnerability. So it has been taken very seriously, and I do deal with this. And as you say, we were fortunate in the nature of these calls, but I do regard it as a matter of some gravity in terms of how we respond to it.
Thank you. And it's undoubtedly something to which we will return again when there may be greater clarity from your perspective. And I have no idea who these people are, so nothing that I say relates to any individual. I just have absolutely no idea who they are. But it's a completely incredible, extraordinarily risky and grave matter, as you say, wholly inappropriate and utterly dismissive, it seems to me, of the extraordinary responsibility that's placed upon people who are engaging with people who, for whatever reason, telephone 999, telephone an emergency. In these cases, nothing that threatened life or limb, but that might not have been the case. I don't know whether any of the colleagues want to. There's one final issue I want to raise in relation to this before we move on to the other elements of the agenda, and it is this. Over the course of some of the public meetings at which we've talked about this topic, there have been, I don't want to say mixed messages, but there has been some confusion on one point, and that is whether there were, I think the colloquial term used was outliers, whether there were people who were disproportionately cancelling calls relative to anybody else who cancelled calls. And I think it's important that we put on the record, for complete clarity and for finality of clarity, that this was the case. There were people. It was clear to those of us who attended at a briefing in Harcourt Square. I think it was in May, I can't remember the precise date. It was clear to me from a briefing that I attended in Galway sometime after that. It has been clear, I think, in the initial engagements with Mr. Penman. And I just wanted to put it clearly on the record and to well, ask you to confirm that my understanding is correct, that there among those who cancel calls, there are people who cancel disproportionately more, and perhaps in some cases much more than others of their colleagues. That is, as I believe, and as has been indicated in the personal engagements I've had with this, and also otherwise. And I put it on the record, and I would just like to ask that perhaps you or one of your colleagues might confirm that my understanding of that is true and accurate.
Yes, that is our understanding. What has to be determined is then just what the approach is in terms to their behaviour. There's been meeting only of last week in which wish to determine what our approach would be to investigation of these, and that's underway. If I might look to Deputy Coxon just to fill out some of the detail on the approach that's been taken in respect of those.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Chair. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Having a little bit of technical difficulties.
You're sounding hollow, but you're audible.
Okay, I'll speak up if that helps. So the Assistant Commissioner of Governance and Accountability, Pat Clavin, has been assigned the discipline portion of this file. As the Commissioner said, there's been a preliminary briefing, but I just want you to know that professional standards, internal affairs, human resources, as well as the anti-corruption unit have all been engaged. There will be a tiered form of investigations in terms of how we look at discipline. And to your point, Chair, outliers will be the first group that will be looked at, and we'll determine how discipline will proceed with them first. There will be a standardized approach implemented across the country using a matrix to determine how many calls were canceled, and that will affect the seriousness of it. It's not as straightforward as it may appear, because sometimes on calls, 4 or 5 people may actually have been involved in the cancelling of the call, but certainly some of that will have to be what gets drilled down into, and certainly we'll learn more from looking at the outliers first, and that will be our first approach. For the next policing authority meeting, I'll have more information with respect to numbers in terms of how we're going to proceed and what an outlier looks like and what determination has been made on that. Thank you.
Thank you, DC Coxon. And yes, I appreciate the complexity of that process. And my principal purpose in this was to clear up any uncertainty that might have been in the minds of anybody who had been observing some of our earlier discussions. That there are those who were in the disproportionate cancelling category. Thank you for that. That's as much as I want to say, other than to reiterate what I said earlier, that we hope at the October meeting to have an interim report from Derek Penman, and we hope that by then also we will have well and truly resolved the data protection questions, and that he will be able to proceed with that part of his work, so that as soon as possible thereafter we will have a full report from him. And we will of course continue to have this on our agenda as a constant item until such time as we believe the substantive range of issues that it gives rise to have been dealt with. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you to your colleagues. I'm now going to move on to the Commissioner's monthly report, and Donal is going to begin on this. Donal de Butler.
Thanks, Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for the July and August reports. I noted that you attended a function on the 25th of August, Commissioner, to award Scott medals to 13 Gardaí for their bravery and heroism in service. And I just thought it was important to mention that, because usually we hear when things go wrong, and sometimes they go very right, and members go out in very difficult circumstances, and God knows what they face. So I just wanted to thought that was a very good function, and commend you on that. The other thing that strikes me on page 23 of the report, you list some very significant successes, and I think it would be very helpful in terms of public confidence in the force if you just summarize some of these, and also what you think are the main challenges.
Okay, well, no, thank you very much. I think there's a couple of themes here. One is just the amount of work that we've done around organised crime, and so and a lot of that has been principally in terms of drugs, and then the Optara operation, which is the divisional-led operation. Now, I would say in respect of the Optara operation at a divisional level, that's been very much in response to what the Joint Policing Committees have asked of us. And so we're very pleased then to see a number of very significant seizures in respect of that. Also then, and within this, we're talking about 1,200 cannabis plants, 15 kilos of cannabis, the value of 1.2 million euro, etc. So that has been good, and it carries on. And a lot of that work, the National Bureau work is often directed at the big organised crime gangs, but the divisional work is being directed at the medium to small term dealers, or smaller time dealers. And that's important as well in terms of just cutting off the routes for drugs. And very often then we are making substantial seizures. Also, it was reported some of the advance that we've made in terms of the ransomware attack on the HSE. We've had very good cooperation with international partners, including Interpol, Europol, other forces, and the FBI in terms of tracking down where that ransomware attack came from, but also identifying where that ransomware originated from, and in effect preventing other individuals been attacked by that ransomware type code. So that in itself, again, has been very successful. Really, in April, when one listened to some of the news, it was as if, well, there was no hope here in terms of crime investigation. And I think we've shown that actually there is a lot that we could do in terms of tracking down the individuals, tracking down the cryptocurrency, etc., and also tracking down where they were based. So there's been very good work done in respect of by cybercrime. In terms of that investigation. And then I'll just highlight the ongoing work and ongoing concern we have in respect of fraud. There's still a lot of approaches being made to individuals around investment fraud, so-called romance fraud as well. All this is about building up relationship of trust and then duping people out of money. And we continue to warn in respect of that and provide crime prevention advice. But again, we've had successes in terms of identifying individuals engaged in this crime. And again, this is a transnational crime, often victim in one country, perpetrator in another, and then the money is spirited off somewhere else. So again, a lot of close cooperation with other law enforcement agencies. So there's been a lot of good work done in respect of that. And lastly then, CAB have issued their annual report. The one thing I would highlight is the investment that we've made in terms of local divisional officers who are trained to assist CAB in local assessments of individuals. And that's around identifying, again, people who aren't the Mr. Bigs, but people who are showing the signs and the trappings of unexplained wealth or wealth obtained through criminality. And that can be jewelry, it can be high-end shoes and handbags, it can be cars, watches, etc. And all of these things are worth pursuing, and information is received and then can be followed through on. And I think that's important in terms of public confidence, that actually if reports are being made, that all of them are being pursued, and that we're not just interested in chasing down, as I say, the Mr. Bigs, but we want to touch down on people, or we want to chase down those who have a big impact in their local community. And the thing about organised crime is it always touches on a community somewhere, either in terms of perpetrators and their victims within a community, or the perpetrators live there and have this aurora around them, which threatens and intimidates others. So anything that we can do to bring individuals to justice and to strip them of their last red cent, we're happy to do. Thank you.
Would you say something about the main challenge face at the moment?
Well, I think we're coming out of obviously out of period of COVID, and it would be difficult to underestimate or overstate, should I say, the organisational impact that's had on us. That was really, it's had a big interruption in training. It's had a big interruption in terms of our recruitment. It's affected our own plans around the operating model. So really just getting all those things re-established and properly restarted again has been a big effort for us all. And then, we look into the winter. There's particular concerns around road safety that we have, but we are also concerned, and we've talked already today about domestic abuse. We have those concerns in respect of domestic abuse and violent crime being perpetrated against vulnerable victims. And there's been some very nasty and vicious attacks on individuals, often motivated by sexual motive. And because we're not appealing for witnesses, we're conducting an investigation, etc., they're not really noticed, and yet it's a big draw on our resources in terms of investigations that we're conducting, but also like the huge impact there is on the victims themselves. And we're very, very mindful of the service that we provide. We're glad that we have the divisional protective service units throughout the country, because we can be assured about the standard of approach then, and we'll wish to develop that. But that's an ongoing concern, and it's starting to really be prevalent in terms of what we're seeing and the nature of the tax upon individuals who are vulnerable.
Thank you very much. Last one from me. It's on page 11 of your report, is that you say it looks like you're not going to get much more in for ICT investment, and that this will have little or no scope for new change initiatives. I suppose the concern is to what extent this will have impact on the reform programme, and what, if anything, we can do about it to sort of mitigate the worst effects of this.
We have to prioritise ourselves, and the issue I think is in respect of capital. We will soon know the government's plans for capital for next year. We have a considerable capital ask in terms of the building programme next year, both Military Road and the completion of that building, but also then we have other demands on our capital from the building programme as well. And so I think ICT and other areas where capital investment is required are likely to suffer. We do have a huge ICT development programme, and every time there's a delay, in effect, that just lengthens out the time that's going to be delivered. And I think we are missing out then on efficiencies, thinking in particular about an HR system, finance system, but also then finishing out the RDMS, which obviously records hours, and also the investigation management system. So RDMS and the investigation management system, they will continue to roll out, and we want to complete those. But we've other significant areas of priority as well, and there's not going to be a great deal of progress in the next really 15 months with those.
And is there anything?
I think the issue is capital. We have to await the final determination on capital, as well as the ICT of the buildings programme, as I've said, but vehicles, and that also includes the air fleet. So overall, we have quite a demand for capital expenditure for the next number of years, not just next year. Right. So it might be then as the beyond 2022, we don't know what the final determination for next year is going to be, that things will open up again, but it's obviously a time of some tightening of the belts in respect of capital, but that does have a direct impact on us. In very many areas, capital is a real facilitator in terms of organisational development, and does drive efficiencies as well.
Okay, that's all for me. I think Paul wants to say something.
Paul.
Thanks, Phil. Good afternoon, Commissioner and colleagues. I have a few follow-up questions arising from the monthly reports for July and August as well. This one might be for Assistant Commissioner Hillman, and it's in relation to the going live, if you like, of a hate crime reporting online facility in July. I'm just wondering, I mean, that's a very welcome development, I think, and I know it's very early days, but I suppose my understanding is from the report that it's been up and running now for 2 months, or a little over 2 months. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that you can report by way of early indication as to take up of that facility, or how it's going?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, and good afternoon, Paul and Police and Authority colleagues. Yes, it has been up and running from the 21st of July. What we have seen is it being used for additional reporting rather than hate crime. We've had over 135 reports, but if we review what has come in terms of focusing on hate crime, we've had 13 reports of hate crime. We've had over 35 other crimes, which we then signpost to the correct department and our bureau. And then we've had some malicious reports as well. So really it's 13 for hate crime, and that is still 13 more reports that we wouldn't have had we not launched this. So I think we're continuing to promote it. It is something I think we hear from victims of hate crime that they perhaps don't want to come into Garda stations, that they don't know how to report. So I think, you know, any additional tool in our toolkit, a different method for reporting is welcomes, and we will continue to monitor and promote it. And we do know through our own National Diversity Forum that they are helping us as our key partners in this area to promote this facility as well.
I'm just wondering, in terms of the discussion that we had earlier on and in previous meetings about, you know, the cancellation of 999 calls, what reassurance can you provide us, or more importantly, members of the public, that contact with this hotline will be handled appropriately and won't suffer the same difficulties that we've seen in the emergency calls?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and enable me to give that reassurance. In the short term, and it is solely the short term, those reports that are coming in via email and coming in through the website are being managed and monitored by the National Diversity Unit. Longer term, our vision will be that they will be embedded in our control rooms, but we're doing that in a phased basis. So for now, it's an additional function that the National Diversity Unit are taking on. They then review them and will then use the internal IT, because that's important equally, that once it's received there, that they then will put it onto Pulse, and it will then go to the relevant divisional and district officer to manage. So in the short term, that's how that assurance, and it is actually being done by, it's being done manually by individuals within that unit. So there is a very good quality assurance around it, but it's one that going forward, we most certainly will have to bring into our control centres and into with that additional training in terms of hate crime. But that's for further down the line.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I move on then, Commissioner, to some of the stats that we saw in the July and August reports around the use of force? In the July report, it notes quite a significant increase in use of force deployment since June. And that seems to have been sustained into August with sort of figures round about a similar level. Do you have any view as to why there was that spike after June and why it has been sustained? Anything that you could say by way of explanation?
I do think there's perhaps there's a little bit of a risk of comparison 1 month to the next. I think, and I know that we reported in that way. I'm not sure what overall lessons or what overall trends I can draw from comparing one month to the month before. One of the factors may just be that we're seeing more in terms of the nighttime economy. There's more people out and about, and public order offences, etc., are starting to show an increase, and therefore then arrests, etc., in respect of that are also increasing. But beyond that, I couldn't really draw any certain conclusions.
Well, is it because one of the other issues that I was going to ask about was, I think it was mentioned earlier on, was the sort of public concern around an increase in antisocial behaviour, particularly in Dublin, in the sort of late spring, early summer. Is there any connection between those? I mean, I just wondered, you might want to say something about the reaction of the police to that problem and what you sought to do to address it. But then also maybe you might want to comment on whether or not there is a link between those two developments, the apparent increase in antisocial behaviour and the apparent increase in the deployment of force.
Well, what we can see from one of the charts just around the public order trend, and if you look at the monthly trend together, then with crimes against the person, and again the monthly trends there in 2021, you can just see an increase in the number of incidents that we've been engaged in. Invariably, they would lead to arrests, and I think then use of force then may come into play, just in determining on the circumstances of the arrest. But I would say that the use of force is still relatively rare, even in terms of making arrests. Now, there's been undoubtedly issues around antisocial behaviour. Every region has had some particular issues to deal with, particularly, I suppose, in more urban centres. And every area or division has had to respond in terms of specific policing plans. If I look at DMR, they've had particular issues as well over the weekend. And again, there's been specific policing plans and resources appointed to those, but the same has been the case in Galway and Limerick and Cork as well. In effect, everyone's had to respond. And in part that it's been just the nature of the nighttime economy, where everything's finishing at 11:30, and indeed then at one stage people weren't really getting into premises at all, and the nighttime economy was very much an on-street economy. So we've had to, and that's part of the response to the pandemic, and we've had to respond to that accordingly. And I think maybe I can, if I look to AC Cagney, she can set out just some of the issues there's been in the centre of Dublin, because that's been the subject of a lot of work and also a lot of commentary.
Thanks, Commissioner. Thanks, Paul. Just Paul, if I just address, some of your concerns about relating to antisocial issues and an increased use of force. So just to reassure you, as you're aware, the plans are evolving right throughout the DMR, and they do evolve on a weekly basis. And I've briefed the committee before in terms of how that's measured and how we significantly change our approaches depending on the issues at hand. And as you're aware, had this been a question that you posed perhaps a number of months ago, we had a different approach in terms of dealing with public order issues and antisocial behaviour. But that public order first line approach has changed, as you know, and that's not our first response in terms of policing the antisocial issues, which we're seeing in pockets across the DMR. I have to say, it's only pockets of behaviour that we're seeing. So in terms of the approach, again, it's a staged approach, a tiered approach, and only where a proportionate use of force is justified are they utilised. And again, part of what we're doing at the moment is that frontline visible presence of our Gardaí on the streets in a preventative mode rather than a reactive mode. And again, that particular plan is working very well right across the city at the moment. And that plan is in place and will be in place. The Commissioner referred to it earlier. That'll be in place right up as far as possibly the end of December. It's working really well for us. So we don't see that there's a kind of a correlation between an increase in the use of force and our current policing approach in accordance with that. Frontline first, when issues arise, you may, and again, only justified have use of force response, but it's not the first response. And I think it's important to note that. And again, back to the issue of the pockets of antisocial behaviour, we are seeing a slight increase, but nothing that should suggest that we should have an increased use of force accordingly. So I hope that clarifies that, please.
Yeah, and I just wonder on the use of force stats, and I think it's still in the DMR that I noticed this, that I think it was in the July report that it was noted that DMR South Central had its lowest reported use of force, I think, in a year. But in August, DMR South Central was one of the two highest areas for the use of force. I'm just wondering, you may not be able to explain why
if you're happy enough, Commissioner, I'll take it.
Yeah.
But I also wondered, sorry, Assistant Commissioner, to what use are these stats put internally in the Gardaí on a monthly basis? So when these stats come in, so for instance, something like that, there's a dip, significant dip, it appears, in the use of force, and then a significant spike in one area. how is that analysed? What does that lead to internally?
Thanks, Paula. And again, just if I take the first aspect of it, that probably counteracts my previous response, because I can tell you that in the month of August, in the DMR, in particular in the South Central, we are seeing an increase in antisocial behaviour and public order issues. And in fact, it's one of the divisions within the DMR where we are seeing an increase as compared to the others. So that may be a reason for an increased use of force. But just to go back on the data, that data does inform, and particularly around the divisional officers and the governance that's in place around the use of force. And that data is examined by them to establish if that use of force is reported correctly and if it's justified in the circumstances.
Okay. And more broadly, I suppose, is that viewed, so that might be within a particular area, but are these stats viewed more broadly, Commissioner, across the force as a whole?
Well, they are qualified here in provisional and operational, and I think when one looks across them, I'm nervous about drawing out conclusions from them as yet. We want to move on to new, more sort of detailed public-facing use of force report, as we say within the monthly report. When we have that, and then we have these figures to give us, in effect, a comparison, then going over a period of time, then we can draw some extrapolate from that in terms of the conclusions that we can draw. One of the things that heartens me is just given the amount of arrests that we would make in any month, how little recourse there is to use of force type tactics in our arrests, and particularly given some of the very difficult situations that we find members in as well. So I think it's a bit early to say around these. The data is still provisional, and we want to get to a point where we've sort of more detailed analysis done of this, and the learning then that we can draw from the trends as opposed to the month-to-month comparisons, because I don't know what the reason is why South Central is low in July and then is amongst the top two in August, and it's something just maybe the vagaries of what happened in that month. So, but it's something that we are aware of and we take notice of. But at the moment there, we just need to develop this further before I think it's going to be a specific tool that tells us a lot.
And I know, just to follow up briefly on that, sorry, I see Assistant Commissioner McMahon wants to come in, but I just wondered, I know Andrew's not here, but is there a timescale for when we can expect to receive that more robust data, if you like, that you might be comfortable with relying on?
My understanding was the end of this year, but maybe Anne-Marie has a better sense of that. Deputy McMahon.
Thanks, Commissioner. Yes, Paul, the end of the year or early in 2022 is the estimated time. But the point I wanted to make is that we're almost completed an online training program in terms of the recording of the use of force. So that may contribute, or may be the reason why the numbers have increased. And I suppose where we want to get to is creating a greater awareness of what constitutes use of force and the accuracy of the data. So we're currently at 87% of the target audience in terms of completion of that training program. I suppose with some confidence, I'm saying that we're in a good place in terms of understanding what it is that needs to be recorded. So absolutely we want to get to accurate recording, data we can stand over, and then I suppose be in a position to analyse it and critique it accordingly. Okay, thank you. I hope I didn't. I might have reduced you in rank there a few minutes ago. I'm sorry if I did. I see the chair. I think Assistant Commissioner Hillman.
Paula, I'm just going to ask you.
Yes, sorry. I was just going to add another point perhaps, and it relates back to the previous question also about finance and IT. Another really great enabler or IT enabler that would help us monitor in this area is body-worn camera. And while we are, and it is reliant on the digital recording bill, and we're doing all the preparatory work, and I'm leading in that project of work about body-worn cameras. But again, it's going to be another project that will be reliant on us organisationally finding the finance if we were to introduce body-worn cameras organisationally. So, you know, in terms of use of force monitoring, you know, standards, behaviour, and reduction in complaints, it's certainly a tool that would help help us in that arena. But I know it will be reliant on us finding the budget as well.
And those would be, of course, body-worn cameras which have no facial recognition technology at all whatsoever.
Yeah,
that's an important intervention from in the context of the discussion that took place at the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Tuesday, and it's one that we have in mind to come back to, and not specifically the issue of facial recognition, although that will feature, but just as this particular bill begins its progress through the Oireachtas, there's material for conversation in that too. Particularly in relation to Section 15. But Paul, I'm interrupting you.
Well, just one final question, if I may.
Yep. Please do.
Again, arising out of the monthly report, Commissioner, I think it's noted, I think it's in the August report about the fact that there were 90 road deaths between January and August, and I think 6 tragically on a single day in August. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you want to say in relation to those numbers, and what steps the Gardaí can take or have taken to try to reduce the occurrence of such incidents.
Thank you very much for the question, because it's an important point of for public discussion and public awareness. You are correct in terms of where we are in our figures this year, and August was a particularly dreadful month. Of the 57 drivers who have died this year, one of the stark facts is that 75% were male, and so it has to be said that there's something about male drivers. And also an element of this is the number of crashes that are happening on our rural roads. 47 drivers, that's 82%, were killed on crashes that occurred on rural roads, and 23 accidents were just single vehicle collisions. And a long-term trend, which has been that these accidents, these fatal collisions, were after midnight. That has now changed, that between 8 p.m. to midnight has become a very dangerous time on the road itself. But research that the RSA undertook showed very strong support for Garda enforcement. We had, Paul and I had a meeting with the RSA on Friday, and if I turn to Paul then to just set out some of the initiatives that we want to take for the rest of this year. But to give you an indication, there was 92% of people who were supportive of Garda enforcement and felt it was either very influential or influential in making a difference to road safety. And so there's been a lot of work in terms of fixed charge notices, and particularly the mobility devices have speeded up the process there, and some 118,000 fixed charge notices have been handed out, have been issued in 2021. But if I turn to Paul just about some of the specifics, Paul, about what's intended over the next few months as we lead in towards Christmas, please.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Commissioner. And just to echo, what the Commissioner said, we're sitting this year to date with 106 deaths on our road. That's down 3 from the same period last year, but August was particularly tragic and and a very dark month on Irish roads. You know, within that 1 month, we had 18 fatal collisions and 24 deaths, and we haven't seen that level of fatalities on our roads since June 2012. Just to put that in context, you know, we really did see, we started the year with a reduction in fatal collisions, but as the year has gone on, that unfortunately that trend has reverted. And it's not, you know, when we talk about this, it's an empty chair at someone's table. These are people and loved ones that people have lost. So that the impact of this is never underestimated by ourselves. As the Commissioner said, we have looked at this and we've worked very, very closely with the Road Safety Authority. So it's a two-pronged approach. It's enforcement and the education. So in terms of enforcement, we have launched a new operation that's going to come into play from October, November, December, the last 3 months of the year, Operation Torum, and it will target regionally. It's a national campaign which will be targeted regionally. So the difference in this campaign, what we normally do is on the regular basis, and it will be overseen by the Garda National Roads Policing Bureau, but we will also be sharing the data with the regions, and there's a chief superintendent in each region who has been appointed by the regional assistant commissioner to lead on roads policing. We'll be sharing the data so that our operations and enforcement are targeted on the trends and what we see in those areas. So as the Commissioner said, you know, 82% of our fatal road traffic collisions are on rural roads. We know, unfortunately, that 1 in 5 people who died on the roads were not wearing their seatbelt. So it will be targeted enforcement to reduce fatal and serious injury collisions, and on those lifesaver offences, drink and drug driving, no seatbelt, mobile phone use, dangerous driving. And we'll be getting the data, and it'll be very much live. There'll be monthly meetings, monthly performance and coordination meetings, so that we're continually reviewing what we're doing in this area and targeting where we need our people on the run up to Christmas. The second part, as I said, was the education piece with the Road Safety Authority and ourselves. And we do know that we have seen, if we put the deaths into the age categories, we have seen, for example, on the over 71s, 18 deaths, 14 of those were drivers. So we're working with Age Friendly and the RSA to develop key messages for those older people who are drivers, because up to now, road safety messages for older people had focused on them being pedestrians or cyclists. So in terms of that age group, with that piece of work ongoing. In terms of the under 30s, then we're going to look at a very bespoke, again, social media, targeting that age group and focus on social media. And then for the 30 to 60 age group, which, you know, the fatalities in that group have more than doubled, we will be continuing with the enforcement and the other education campaigns that we have, which are both mainstream media, some TV campaigns and social media as well. So working closely, enforcement and education.
Very much. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner and Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Paul. Just one thought arising from the conversation earlier on the use of force. There are, of course, more types of force than firearms, batons or tasers, and it's perhaps for another occasion, but I wonder whether there is any way that you capture that sometimes necessary, but sometimes perhaps completely unnecessary uses of force. And is that captured in any way, or is that an issue that you're able to monitor in any way in terms of the appropriateness of the efficacy of performance? As I say, I haven't given you notice of this, but perhaps something we'll turn to at another meeting.
I do think there is something about actually. Well, we use the expression outliers again. So individual members and their behaviours and how those behaviours then are reflected on the ground in terms of, and it's not just about, use of force incidents, also around complaints, etc. So, and that then is actually a performance issue. So there is a piece in, I think, to lift from this. But this wouldn't be the complete picture itself. You would also need data of complaints being made by the members of the public, etc.
Yeah, Very good. Thank you. We might come back to that at some stage, Commissioner. Thanks. The next and final topic from this afternoon's meeting is the question of community policing. From the beginning of the authority's existence almost 6 years ago, the issue of policing in the community and the nature of community policing has been one that, excuse me, has been a regular, constant feature of our attention and focus of discussion at many meetings. And that focus has increased in recent times, very particularly because of the events of the last 18 months and the health emergency and the way in which the Garda Síochána have responded to that by their presence in and engagement with the community, and by the very substantially positive response from the public to that. And the value that has been identified by the public in the approach that has been reflected through that. And also, of course, this is reflected in the approach of the organisation itself, your focus on community policing, the development of a community policing framework. And the oversight of the policing during COVID and the outreach to organisations up and down the country have given the authority really good insight into the value that's placed on community policing. And certainly for us reinforces the fact that there isn't a hierarchy of policing. There isn't a hierarchy of roles within the Garda Síochána. People do different things, but they're not hierarchically ranked in people's esteem and people's regard and in the impact that they have on people's lives. And this month, there's a particular focus from the authority on the issue of community policing. This discussion today, meeting of the chairs and others of the joint policing committees next week, engagement with the community is a very useful, informative, open, frank, honest, engaged public conversation, albeit within the limitations of our times, in the Mayfield and the Glen area of Cork, with people from the community, people from the Garda Síochána community guards, the chief superintendent, people from the national side of community policing as well. And every organisation tends to consider the public response to its service through the lens of its own aspirations. This is a not confined to the Garda Síochána or indeed the policing authority. It's a universal, I think, in relation to the way organisations engage or think about the public response to them. And those kind of engagements are very useful in enabling each for a moment to step into the shoes of the other and get a sense of how the one perceives the other and how the service is perceived by the people. This conversation today, this engagement, is set into that context of a deep and an undoubtedly continuing engagement by the authority with that significance of community policing and the impact that it has on people's perception of the quality of their lives and people's sense of their own safety as well as their actual safety. So Moling is going to lead on this for the authority today.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. We've had the benefit of seeing your draft community policing framework, and we've noted the 6 principles underpinning community policing, or the proposed structure of community policing: engagement with communities, information-led community policing, delivering a responsive policing service, policing by partnership, developing and supporting people, and an ethical and human rights-based community policing service. And you've also outlined 13 objectives. Maybe it might be no harm, maybe starting with just the definition of community policing, which doesn't appear in your framework but is on your website, but certainly gives a context, better context for our discussion. So community policing in Ireland is a partnership-based, proactive, community-orientated style of policing. It is focused on crime prevention, problem solving and law enforcement. with a view to building trust and enhancing the quality of life of the entire community. Now, what I'm interested in is from the perspective of the urban dweller, the rural dweller, the young person, whatever. What I'm interested in is in a situation as you anticipated, say in 2 years' time, with community policing extending right across the entire country. If I'm living in a rural area, non-urban area, what difference could I expect from the policing approach to my community than exists currently? And I accept fully you will make the point, and it's reflected in during time of COVID, that community policing has been part and parcel of the manner in which you've operated over the years.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and it's a good opportunity for us to set out our stall in terms of our intentions around community policing through the introduction of the operating model. And so in rural areas, we've an undertaking to maintain our network of stations, and indeed as civilianization or workforce modernization has happened, we've been able to populate those stations either to provide an individual or increase the complement from 1 to 2, and increase stations from just being part-time to having a member aligned to them full-time. But the approach is one of geographic areas which have then a community policing team assigned to them. Community policing teams then will be supervised by sergeants, and then an inspector then taking responsibility for an area. We've set out some of that within our strategy. At the moment, that's proven difficult because we are only just starting off on the sergeant's promotion process, and also then the inspector's promotion process will have to follow on the heels of that as well. So there's a piece about just getting the necessarily qualified people to undertake this. So within the 2 years that we have set out in front of us, we'll want to map out the various community policing areas, have a thorough understanding of those areas, and we set out in the strategy there what that will entail, the identification of the various characteristics of an area. But also then, over the next 2 years, we want to understand more about community safety in its wider sense, and how then other statutory agencies and voluntary agencies are going to assist in terms of improving the quality of life for people. Our part of that is obviously the prevention and detection of crime, dealing with antisocial behaviour, dealing with street level drug dealing or other nuisance. But there's other factors to play as well, and we'll want to work in partnership with them. So there's a lot of work for us to do, somewhat interrupted by COVID-19. But at the same time, I would say in COVID-19, we really found ourselves again in terms of being a community policing service. And we've done a lot to try and cement that. There's our ongoing, including my own engagement with JPCs. We've made this commitment around smaller stations. We want to see what else we might do through alternative delivery of stations, be it in shop fronts or within other buildings, within other community buildings, to further extend that network, particularly in areas of growth of population. We've introduced community patrol vehicles, which are the white vehicles with just the Garda logo on it, and also then the high visibility vehicles that we've introduced as well. So we've moved from an effect almost like to a Battenberg, and that's all about visibility. And I would also add in then over the next 2 years, development of the reserve strategy and the recruitment of reserve and their part then within these community policing teams as well. And we want to do that in a very focused way, so they develop local contacts with us.
The challenge, Commissioner, would be exactly. I note what you say in relation to Garda stations, and you place particular emphasis on the visibility of cars and Gardaí. But there is that challenge and the potential difference between the visibility of a Gardaí and actual presence in the community. And this is where I was seeking to direct my question, direct your attention. Is how will I feel that difference? Are you suggesting that I feel safer, that that you'll be more accessible, that there will be sort of very much sort of an ethos or culture of sort of engagement with the community, which may not be as evident today, or as consistently evident, should I say, as you might want it?
Well, what we're trying to do is taking the best practice that we've identified ourselves, and indeed people have reflected back to us, and through being then a lot of what people have said to us about how responsive we are to their needs and what we can do either to help them or point them in the right direction. So each of the community policing teams within divisions will have administrative support, and that's to help about non-emergency community concerns, working then with other agencies, timely response to community needs, etc. So in the rural areas, often there's a very personal relationship. That is diluted, I have to say, in the more urban areas. And there's some areas then that require greater Garda attention than others, and that's for a variety of factors. Because crime and antisocial behaviour doesn't touch on areas. Sorry.
Yeah, perhaps you might address that particular area which you've just drawn our attention to, and that's the urban area. And it's come up in quite a number of discussions, authority discussions, and indeed discussions with you, notably in socially, economically disadvantaged areas, where we've had feedback in relation to the extent of meaningful involvement or engagement by Gardaí with very open and visible drug dealing and so on. What difference can communities in such areas anticipate arising from your focus and emphasis and redirection to community policing?
Well, so if you take the workforce modernisation, that's freed up 760 odd individual Garda members. All of those individuals have stayed in divisions. We've had an increase in the size of the organisation. It's to be further increased. Some of that, and indeed the lion's share of that, is going to be for divisions. So we have an increase in footprint in terms of our visibility and numbers to deploy. Within the strategy then, we talk about the mapping of areas, and all these areas, they'll all have their unique parts, but in terms of the urban environment, we'll be looking at population density, the demographics, the deprivation index, the demands upon us, and we will have then a community policing response, which is working with partners and as we say, being responsive then to the community needs and desires. So the good practice that we're having, in effect, we're trying to introduce that throughout the country, throughout the organisation, and learn from that and develop it. So what we'd hope is that people would see a far more responsive Garda Síochána dealing with their issues on the ground. It's very difficult to say, oh, this is definitely what people are going to see, but you raise the issue of street level dealing. Street level dealing, in part, we have a lot of responsibility in respect of deterring and preventing and detecting that. But also then if we work with partners, then we can design out some of these issues, but also then we can start to divert young people and others to other areas. And it's through working with partners then that we'd hope to do that. So that, there's other diversions then that we'd wish to be involved with, but necessarily it may not be us leading on them. So others providing other outlets for young people. So that's where we want to get to, where we're working closely with others around just, I suppose, the places of risk or places of demand, and then what we're doing then to divert and displace from there.
You quite rightly raised the issue engaging, the requirement to engage with various other bodies. And indeed, in the definition of community policing, there is a specific reference to partnership. I mean, one of the challenges that we've noted in a different context is the challenge of sharing information with various other bodies. This has been a challenge, for example, in relation to child protection areas, and you've had some challenges in that area. How do you anticipate that you'll ensure effective engagement with various bodies that can support or complement the objectives that you're setting for community policing? How close do you anticipate the engagement will be? How structured will be? How effective will be the engagement, the information sharing process?
If I might bring Paul in just here in a minute around that, but what I would say is that we hold data, but other services also hold a huge amount of data relating to particular individuals or groups of individuals or families, which would indicate a huge state effort in respect of people. And we do need to understand in a collective sense what that demand is, and then how we might mitigate and deal with the various issues that can arise with an individual or a family. And so information sharing at some level is going to be absolutely essential, and that's going to involve council, education, and in some cases then obviously then TUSLA and other health authorities as well. But if we can look to Paula just about the work that's been undertaken in respect of that, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And just really to also a further update on what the Commissioner's been saying, Maureen, actually about our community policing resourcing as we know it. So some of the work that was outlined by the Commissioner is relating to how we will align our resource to the mapping and as the country is mapped. But even already in the here and now, because we're doing community policing here and now. So what we do know as well is already we have 1,632 Garda members aligned to community policing. And how we've based that is in July last year, we ratified organisationally a definition for operational community policing. So yes, you give the definition of what is community policing. So then last year, the service executive team and the senior leadership team agreed the definition. So what we will count as community policing Garda. So we police with a community policing ethos, but there's three categories. Those in urban areas who are full-time assigned to community policing teams. In the medium density areas where, yes, some regular members do community policing, we're not counting those in those medium density areas. It's solely the people, the members who are aligned to community policing who perhaps cover several towns in those areas, those guards assigned to either single Gardaí or two Gardaí stations. So under those three definitions, that's how we've come to the figures that we have. And we know, and we have it broken down by the four regions, that we have 197 sergeants and 1,435
Can I ask you one question on that?
Aligned to community policing. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a question on that? And I commend the issue of actually signing a sort of discrete number and having a structured approach. But it appears to me, looking at your draft framework, that there's significant autonomy within individual divisions in relation to assignment of community guarding. And the Commissioner has already outlined the pressures that there are on Garda resources. How can you and the Guard as a whole and the Commissioner be assured that there's a consistency of approach at a national level in terms of the assignment of Gardaí to community responsibilities and roles?
I think you're very right. At the national level, we provide the national framework and the national principles that we want to work within, as that translates down then to translate into operational activity. It is for regional assistant commissioners, divisional officers and district officers and community engagement superintendents on the operating model, they do have to allocate resource to risk. So there may be times that resource will be allocated to higher risk areas. And I think that's something certainly at the national level that we understand that. But I think the principle is that we have those members assigned to community policing to problem solve, to be visible. We will, when we get our IT updated, they will be, from one of your earlier questions, people will be able to go onto the website and see who their local guard is. That's being said, I know in many areas, especially rural areas, people know that already. But just to have that other function. But I think a great opportunity perhaps is one you mentioned earlier about monitoring. I think even under the current Joint Policing Committee structure, but I think under the new community policing partnership structure, there could be a great opportunity there to evaluate and really look at that community policing model. And we know we have the 3 pilot areas in North Dublin, Waterford and Longford. We're closely engaged with the department about that, and the 3 chairs have been appointed. So there is something in those areas perhaps that we could look at to might address some of the questions that you're raising about and the role of the new community safety partnerships going forward. And I think that would also link in, because those community safety partnerships will have all the statutory organisations around the table. So when you were asking the question about what will engagement and structure look like, I think that it's not solely about, the Commission of Future Policing in Ireland said, policing is not the sole responsibility of the Gardaí. And I think many of those partners sitting around that table will assist us in delivering, making communities safer. We will play our role as Gardaí, but the other partners can as well.
2 other quick areas, because I know we're under some time pressure, Chair. Very quickly. Firstly, I'm interested in the issue of how you propose communicating and the focus and emphasis on community policing to members of the public, including taking in the lessons from the 4 pilot divisions. My feeling, and I think it's reflective of what Donald asked earlier, that the Gardaí may not be really good at actually highlighting its successes. So I'm interested in terms of how you might set about communicating community policing on a national level, and secondly, communicating the successes of community policing and further developments at a national level.
Yeah. Commissioner, are you happy if I take that? Or did you?
So yeah, carry on, Paul. Yeah, doing well.
Yeah, well, I think one of them I potentially referenced, which was we will start having people, we will have our community Gardaí on our external website, and I think that's one enabler. We're also currently, because I recognise that is going to take some time because it has to fit in with our IT structure. So currently our National Community Engagement Bureau are looking at designing some literature that we will give out consistently that community Gardaí can use. So we'll have a consistent, maybe some posters, some other literature that they can use both online or give out around local community groups. So we want to do something for the here and now. So there's a short-term deliverable, I think, will assist with that and bring consistency. Secondly, what was the second part of your question, Willie?
The second part was communicating the successes as well as the developments. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we've set up, and again, really important. I mean, we do, and I know even we're doing the returns, and you see our returns monthly. But what we've set up internally as part of our toolkit and the work we're doing, the training, is a sharing good practice on the section on the website. So this will allow Gardaí to say, Sergeant Mullally, when he was down in Longford and some work he did, we can put it up. This is what we did in Longford. If anyone else would like information on this, please contact the local sergeants and things like that. Now, we will oversee it. We will share that good practice. But I think that a bit like not so much a lessons learned, but a sharing of good practice and knowledge hub that is really important, because I see it all the time as well. I mean, sometimes you're on social media and you go, that's a really good, I saw one recently up Northwest with the mugs. And things like that, which I know my colleague AC O'Brien has sent down to us to circulate. So if we're going to have that structure, it's going to be our internal website, and Garda members can access it.
I would say that your news-based publication is excellent. I know there is something that in future meetings that we will address the whole issue of data analysis and all of those areas and the capacity to ensure that. But I might maybe just final point, Chair, and that is in relation to the challenges facing individual community Gardaí. or people, a Gardaí acting in a community, in a community context. And there are issues, particularly in the context of younger people, and that's the issues, for example, the challenge that there might be, or the dilemma in relation to engagement and enforcement. And it's a difficult one to seek to maintain that sense of community policing, and at the same time the requirement to enforce as a matter of course. And there is that issue then of the perception of the Gardaí, or the perception of the relationship between young people and Gardaí, or the perception of young people in certain areas with the Gardaí. Have I made myself reasonably clear in terms of the dilemma that the Gardaí can face?
Well, it is a dilemma, but it is community policing. But policing isn't just about detection; it's also about prevention. And part of that prevention is actually, looking at ways in which we can divert young people away from crime. And so, it is a very legitimate work on our part to work with others, particularly youth services, around finding other outlets for people, young people in particular, other than crime. So, but at the same time, I don't make any apologies for the work that community police have to do, and just in terms of simple enforcement. There are laws which they are going to obviously have to work to enforce, and that's necessary just in terms of prevention of crime, but also public safety as well. So, but it is a question of trust and the relationship that we build up and diverting young people. But we have to have something to divert them to. If all that we are left with is just ourselves on the deck, then the tactics that we have open to us are limited, and for community safety in its widest sense to work, other agencies have to be actively engaged, and that's a range of agencies between the local councils, but also then education and health, because the problems that we're trying to tackle are multifaceted and deep, and in some cases intergenerational as well. We are dealing with a lot of symptoms of that. We wish to address the causes with others, but our levers in those causes are somewhat limited as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner and Chair.
I'd muted myself. I apologise. Thank you, Maureen. And Debbie?
Thanks, Sharon. Good afternoon, Commissioner and colleagues. I know that we are very short on time, and I did want to come back to the issue of the reserves, and Commissioner, you did say, give some indication of what your thinking is in terms of how, what happens to the reserves in the future and how they're used. But I want you to sort of imagine that the cadre of reserve officers are watching now. What might you say to them about your vision for their future, the aspirations of the Garda Síochána, how they, for example, how they will be deployed, what sort of things, areas that they will work in, and how you might address potentially some of the perceptions within the rest of the organisation that reserves may feel as a barrier to their progress at the moment. Thank you. I know that there's quite a lot wrapped into there, but we're
okay. No. Well, the first thing I would say to the reserves that are listening is to thank them very much for the service that they provide. Yesterday, I signed 10 certificates of service for individuals who had provided already 10 years of service to Garda Síochána and to their local communities. The first thing is to highlight their importance, and that our vision is that they will be embedded then within community policing teams, that there'll be an extra conduit to the local community. I think looking forward, we want to have a recruitment of reserve next year. But part of that, we want to target towards communities and groups who are less well represented in Garda Síochána, and use that as a gateway for individuals who may not have considered a career in Garda Síochána or involvement within Garda Síochána as, in effect, a manner, a way in which they can get involved, provide volunteer service and learn more about policing, and maybe even consider it as a career. We want to look at the training they have and ensuring that they're effective, but that does require a commitment in terms of the hours that they would do, and we're doing an audit of that. We're looking towards a commitment of at least 60 hours a year to make it worth our while in terms of the training we want to do, but also the equipment that we need to provide them, and also then to update what their roles and responsibilities would be within a community policing team. We have consulted with the Garda Reserve members that we have. I think we want to break some of the sort of myths there is around this. I think one of the things about independent patrolling, that we train them and then trust them to undertake independent patrolling, but also then to review the Garda powers that they have available to them as well. So there's a lot to be done there, both in their role and context, but also their training and development. One of the avenues that is being explored is can it be used as a route to then to join, in effect, the full-time, to join as a full-time member of the organisation. And we're very supportive and positive of that. I think, you know, an individual who joins the reserve, they get the chance to have a good look at us, and we also have the opportunity to have a good look at them as well. And lastly, I would say we do see it as an opportunity, maybe for areas such as the Gaeltacht areas, where we can increase the number of our Irish speakers. But as I've said as well, I think it's another important element in terms of underrepresented groups. And we want to look at areas where that would have particular impact, and that might be North and West DMR in particular. So targeting the recruitment to areas, and then we're considerably short of what our recognised complement would be. And so there's a lot of innovation I hope that we can bring to the recruitment. We're working with the Public Appointment Service in respect of that. And certainly we haven't launched this strategy because I think it's a bit hollow if you're not running a recruitment program at the same time. So I think the two should go hand in hand there. But no, we see a reserve certainly as a good way of developing our community policing teams, but also developing how representative we are as an organisation.
Maybe say something a little bit more about, sorry, we're getting some echo here. Maybe you could say something a little bit more about the numbers that are currently available to you and the numbers that you plan to recruit.
May I look to Paula? Have you those figures, Paula, on the deployment and the amount of reviews we're doing?
Yeah, certainly, Commissioner, we do. I do. Yes, and Debbie, I'd just like to really echo the comments the Commissioner said to those reserves, and I have engaged with some of them since I've started, and they're very much valued in the work they do, and we see that firsthand, the work that they do. But I think one of the things we've also wanted to do is we've recognised organisationally that there are areas where it's working very well and areas where the Garda Reserve perhaps haven't felt as much part of the team and certainly haven't been utilised as what we would have hoped. And that's exactly the piece of work that we are doing, and the Commissioner referenced. So as of August, as of the 31st of August, we have 447 Garda Reserves on our establishment. So that's what we have on our establishment. But what we did when we were doing some of the work in preparation for the strategy, we recognised that there were over 200, actually 206 Garda Reserve members who hadn't worked in over 2 years, and that's also taken it prior to COVID. It's not so much because of COVID they hadn't, because we did, while we encouraged and welcomed to work during COVID, just some competing demands because of day jobs. So during the COVID period, it was dealt with very much on a case-by-case basis, but this is really pre-COVID. So what we did was we have a plan, we have set out, and we're halfway through our plan of engaging with individually with each of those. Each regional AC has been asked to appoint an inspector to personally contact those reserves. And this is very much, hopefully, with the review of returning them to Garda Reserve duties with some perhaps refresher training as required. So, I'm pleased to say already 71 of them wish to come back to carry out their duties. Some do wish to resign, and we'll look at that and ensure that they are given the appropriate certificates, but also find out the reasons. Now, some of them are going in, resigning because they are going in to become a full-time member, but some, we'll just look at the reasons so that we can bring that into our learning for going forward, because that's what we really want to ensure, that they're a valued member of our teams, but that consistently, there's a consistent approach to how we support and how they're detailed and deployed. And where we do see it very much where they have a point of contact, I've met some of them. I was down at Cork at one event, and I met 3 Garda Reserves, each very clearly with their own their local sergeant who was the point of contact. And that point of contact, whether it's in the city or urban or rural environment, I think is vital to build up that relationship. And I think the second thing as well that we want to do to bring that consistency is, and it's in the strategy, is to establish a regional engagement forum with them. So while we are doing engagement at a national level, because we recognise they're not represented by staff associations the way our full-time members are, but it is important that they have a voice, and we give our members a voice and our employee engagement with them. So we are going to, it's been drafted, it just has to go out to the regional ACs, ask them to set up a regional engagement forum with their Garda Reserves. And I think that's really important, because that will allow us, and then it can feed it into the national office, to hear from the reserves themselves what's working and share that, and actually what we need to do differently. So consistent approach, and we will get back to hopefully that what my aim will be is that the people we have in our books are all operationally deployed, and people we have in our establishment. So that's where we want to be. In terms of future recruitment, I don't have that detail. We don't know when that will be happening, but certainly, and that's as the Commissioner said, we're not launching the strategy. We will publish it so that some people have access to it and people are aware of it, but we really want to align that to recruitment as well. So I'm not sure when that will be.
Do you have any indication about the numbers that you're hoping to recruit? Is your complement going to stick around 447, or is that going to increase?
The restraining factor on this is the number of Garda members that we can recruit next year. So we don't know the final figures of that. I would be hoping to recruit between 600 and 800. If it's the higher end of that doesn't leave much space then for reserve recruitment. But we would have hoped to try to recruit about 200 next year. But that's a big undertaking for our training establishment. But there's the small matter of money to pay for it as well.
Okay, Commissioner, thank you very much for that, and thanks very much for Paula for some of that detail. It's something that we will come back to when it's launched, because this is a key element to how you take forward community policing and how reserve officers are used, and of course you would like enough of them to be effective in that sense and to make that difference. Chair, do I have any time to ask one more question on a different topic?
You do indeed. You do, Debbie.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to ask very briefly about COVID. Now, clearly, COVID has been very restrictive for you, Commissioner, in terms of how you use resources, because it has been focused largely on the, I suppose, the compliance of the regulations. Now those are raised, a lot of those resources, you know, have they been redeployed? Have they been redeployed to where they previously came from? Or has there been decisions around prioritisation of areas that they have been deployed in?
Well, our overall commitment to supporting the government effort around the placing of restrictions has much diminished. There's only a number of areas where we would have involvement now, and there's not a huge demand for our intervention in respect of those, and that's diminishing all the time. So it's very clear just in the amount of enforcement that we're doing that our actual overall work as in effect policing restrictions is very much diminished. The great majority of those who in effect were mobilised towards on the ground sort of operational policing to enhance visibility, but particularly around the checkpoints and also policing of the actual restrictions, they've returned to what their core duties would have been, so things like training, etc. But we still have, in effect, we still have an emergency roster, and that allows then for, us to maintain as best we can a safe working environment. We have to make the, in effect, deployment assumption that we've got a mixed workforce in terms of whether people are vaccinated or not, have the vaccine or not. And so we're just being prudent about that. In that we've seen the very worst of this in terms of individuals contracting COVID and us having a big loss of resource, and we've managed a lot of this through the prudent action we've taken around rosters, but also then the distribution of protective equipment. So as we're coming out of this, then we're making appropriate decisions, and so that those situations will ease as well.
Okay, thanks. Can I move on to then, you've mentioned before about some of the lessons learned, and you mentioned earlier about particularly around community policing and COVID and some of the things you've learned and some of the things that have changed as a consequence of that. But there must be other areas around how policing of COVID restrictions has suggested other ways of working and doing things. And my question is around what reflection overall within the organisation there has been on those lessons and the difference that those lessons can make now, or will make to the future service delivery of policing. Now, it's something that it's a big topic, and it's something that we will come back to in a more substantive way at a later date this year. But maybe you could give us some indication, initial indication, Commissioner. Thank you.
Yes, well, at last week's Strategic Human Rights Committee, there was questions raised about the policing of COVID-19, and I think we haven't quite reached the point of reflection. We're still, if I might put it another way, we're still recovering our balance in terms of the organisation and getting things back in place and getting things moving again. But there's a number of elements of this. There's the human rights impact around the restrictions and the policing of those restrictions. There's a community policing aspect as well in terms of just the difference that made and how we would reflect and build on that, because I do think there was a real re-establishment of the link with all the communities that we police in terms of us helping those who might be vulnerable or isolated. There's a necessary piece of work just about the emergency plan of this. Unfortunately, what we're promised is this will happen again. and there's lessons that we have learned which may not be needed for another, hopefully many years, but it would be good if we would set out just on reflection what the initial response, what we might have done differently, how we might have prioritized things, and as the national health emergency lengthened and deepened, how we responded as well. So there's a number of elements of that, but I have to say we haven't commenced that work yet. But already the question arises, well, what have you learned? What would you do differently? And what's the, I suppose, enduring learning for us going forward now? But if we were faced with a similar scenario, what have we learned in terms of the immediate response?
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair, that's me.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Commissioner and colleagues. And on that, the very last point that the Commissioner made, I think that there's room for discussion between us, both in private and in public in the future in relation to that very point, but also the way in which the very positive elements of the COVID experience can be embedded as an enduring part of the future approach to policing, as you've said yourself and as we've said consistently too. I think that every member of the Garda Síochána, everybody who works in the Garda Síochána lives in a community, is part of a community, engages with the community. Some obvious exceptions where people can't do so, but the vast majority do, and they too have part of the role to play in the shaping and the forming of community policing and in the presence of the Garda Síochána within communities. And even though those who are specifically assigned to community policing represent just 11% of the total number of Garda members, as I say, most of the others have in one way or another, and very, very many do, of course, in their own communities on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, participate actively in the lives of those communities in ways that are never fully understood. No organisation fully understands the extent to which the people who work in them have other roles beyond their work lives. But it's an important dimension of the community, the shaping and the understanding of the community potential of the Garda Síochána. I worry a little bit about the notion that that community Gardaí can be moved to areas of higher priority. If serving the community, if community policing is part of the foundation, it doesn't help the stability if you pull a block out here and there when one is missing somewhere else. Of course, there are emergencies when everybody puts all hands on deck to whatever it may be, but it's a reflection that might merit some further consideration, certainly on our part. Thank you, Commissioner, and your colleagues for their contributions at this session and at the earlier session when there were some other of your colleagues present. And thank you to my own colleagues and the authority for the active engagement today. So that brings today's meeting to a close. We will probably have a public dimension, perhaps not as long as this one, at our October meeting to accommodate the discussion of the CAD 999 issue and the Derek Penman's interim report. And our next scheduled regular full-scale public meeting will be at the end of November. Thank you very much indeed to everybody, and that brings this meeting to a close.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.